Now, we'd like to commence the first session of our conference under the topic Marine Genetic Resources, including the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. His Excellency Conrad Jan Marciniak, Judge of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, will moderate this session. Judge Marciniak, now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, colleagues, excellencies. Let me join the words of others in thanking for invitation and for the wonderful preparations leading up to this conference. I'm really happy about it. Also, we have a wonderful lineup of speakers today. I shall introduce them shortly. And MGRs also, when during the negotiations, were often the first topic under the negotiations. We also go first. And as Judge Hayder and Judge Peck alluded to, I think this panel will offer a rather unique opportunity because we see a very unique mixture of traditional law of the sea topics and a bit of novel ones relating both to the nature of the resources in question as well as some novel approaches in terms of benefit sharing related to them. So first, we will start with Ambassador Janine Elizabeth COYE-FELSON, who's a senior and experienced diplomat of Belize. She's now the Deputy Permanent Representative of Belize to the United Nations, but also had other experiences in various environmental, climate, and finance-related negotiations, but perhaps in particular from the perspective of today's conference, she also facilitated MGR's negotiations during the conference, but also holds a position at the University of Melbourne. So she has a good mixture of practice and theoretical reflection on the topic. Having said that, I will shortly invite Janine to start, but let me say two things. I'll invite you to have a look at the more extended biographies of the speakers. They're in the brochure in front of you. And secondly, we have agreed within the panel that we will save some time for a Q&A session at the beginning. So we are aiming to have some 20-30 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So bear that in mind, write down your questions if you have, and then we'll try to make it more interactive if possible. And with that, Janine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Conrad, and I will go to the podium to give my presentation. First of all, let me thank you, Conrad, for the kind introduction. You missed one thing. I'm a mom, and I think it's apropos to this current session that we're speaking to the next generation of law of the sea practitioners will need to address to highlight that. Excellencies, colleagues, all protocol observed, and let me, of course, thank the organizers for their generosity in bringing us here to Seoul for what I think is a thought-inspiring theme conference, Law of the Sea for the Next Generation. But I will attempt, through this generation, to challenge our frame of thinking as we look beyond the provisions that were agreed to the steps we must take now to implement. So I will attempt to set the scene, but much of this scene has already been set by the presentations earlier this morning, so I'll run through these pretty quickly, and then I will take a deeper dive into the very provisions of Part 2. But before doing that, I want you to consider how these provisions could instruct a fundamental reset of our understanding of ocean governance as seen through the perspective of small island developing states. And we've already begun to hear about how this new agreement can actually do this. This is my screensaver. I'm keeping track of who signs and who ratifies. I hope you do too. I won't go into this, but you know the various dates: 19th of June, adopted, open for signature, 22nd of September, and we need 60 ratifications for the agreement to enter into force. We've heard about how much this agreement has been hailed as a triumph of multilateralism, words of the United Nations Secretary General, and the first to comprehensively address conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And it does so with a preamble, 12 parts, 76 articles, and 2 annexes. You've already heard about the main elements, so I won't go through those, and the importance of the cross-cutting issues which create the constitutive structure of the agreement as a whole. Achieving agreement on Part 2 required maneuvering between 2 legal regimes, and we heard the keynote speaker address those: common heritage and freedom of the high seas. Eventually, we had to find compromises so that we could actually finalize Part 2 on the very last day, in the very last hours of the resumed session of the 5th IGC, Intergovernmental Conference. I want to highlight the fact that small island developing states had a very integral role to the success and to the conclusion of that Part 2. For those of you who are not familiar with small island developing states, they're a global grouping of 39 countries and 18 associated members of the UN regional commissions, coming from the Caribbean, the Pacific, Africa, the Indian Ocean, and South China Sea. The 39 countries are all members of a major negotiating group called the Alliance of Small Island States, which is typically associated with climate change, but the Alliance of Small Island States, also known as AOSIS, has been at the forefront of many breakthroughs in international law and global development policies. The subgroups of AOSIS from the Anglophone and Francophone Caribbean, known as the Caribbean Community, and from the Pacific, known as the Pacific SIDS or PSIDS, coordinate negotiating positions. And importantly, in the BBNJ negotiation, these 2 subgroups had very significant roles working side by side in pushing the ambition of this agreement. Together with 2 other major negotiating groups, the African group and the core like-minded Latin American countries, together they proposed a proposal called the Super PAC proposal that helped to shape Part 2. Of course, this interacted with other proposals from like-minded countries from the developed country constituencies. They also most significantly brought to the table a very unique perspective on how the BBNJ agreement could reframe our relationship to the ocean, moving away from a mere physical approach to governance towards a more relational approach. That approach is born of the integral interlinkages of SIDS and the ocean and its resources. I have here SIDS aquatories. I came across that terminology and think it's appropriate. They're much larger than SIDS territories. They're land territories. 82% of the area occupied by the Caribbean islands are marine, or is marine, and 98% of the area occupied by Pacific islands is ocean. The ocean is integral to small island developing states' livelihood, survival, and identity. Their connection is not only defined by their territory, being coastal or low-lying coastal states, but it's also defined ecologically and culturally. In the far right-hand corner, you see the biological corridors of species that originate or spawn in the Caribbean, but have a cycle that takes them into areas beyond national jurisdiction. On the left-hand upper, depends on where you're sitting, I guess. The map is a display of the jurisdiction of the Pacific Small Islands. And then we have images of how the sea is connected to the livelihoods and the culture of the people of the Pacific and the Caribbean. So we have the fisher folks in Kiribati And then we have the Garifuna people of Belize, an indigenous group, and their strong connection to the Caribbean Sea. Interestingly, the Garifuna also can be found along the coast of Central America. But much of the habitat and the ecosystems that have sustained life on the Caribbean and Pacific Islands are under threat by anthropogenic stressors like climate change, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and biodiversity loss. Some of these threats are existential. So you can imagine that this is very important for small island developing states to see a reset of our relationship with nature, in particular with the ocean. So that idea of that reciprocal relationship with the ocean is a narrative that really dominated the narrative of the small island developing states in the BBNJ process. The relationship is based on what is known as a relational ethos, as I've discovered from theory, that transcends a state-centric jurisdictional approach and brings to bear concepts of common identity, common responsibility, and shared stewardship. To quote from the Pacific SIDS, "As descendants of the continent Moana, the ocean links our sea of islands, establishing our common identity, and therefore making it critical for us to protect and promote our Pacific Ocean through shared stewardship. The reciprocity engendered in the communion of people, land, and sea expressed in these narratives of small island developing states stands in stark contrast to a more extractive relationship seemingly engendered in the contemporary complex of rules, arrangements, and frameworks that have been developed for the governance of the ocean and seas beyond national jurisdiction." The Pew Charitable Trust did a mapping of ocean governance institutions and came up with this patchwork representation. 20 bodies and agreements have been established to manage ocean resources and manage human activities in the high seas. These are comprised of regional fisheries management organizations, regional seas organizations, and global sectoral organizations, none of which have a comprehensive cross-sectoral mandate or regulatory authority, nor focus on conservation or areas beyond national jurisdiction. Now, the Second World Ocean Assessment found that there were major challenges with intersectoral cooperation, coordination, and information sharing, and developing new instruments in time to address emerging challenges, which in turn would impact upon the effectiveness of conservation and sustainable use. It further pointed out the need for actions and efforts to focus on implementation gaps or any regulatory gaps in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And I pause here just to recall that this type of patchwork arrangement stands in stark contrast to that relational approach that small island developing states introduce into the narrative of BBNJ, and I think really important for us to recognize as we move towards implementation. So let's now move ahead to the actual provisions of Part 2. And again, just to repeat, the main tension here that we had to overcome was this tension between two competing regimes, common heritage of humankind and the freedom of the high seas. This really put developed and developing countries head to head, with developing countries arguing for the application of common heritage of humankind and developed countries for the freedom of the high seas. Notably, though, there was an agreement that freedom of fishing would not be included across both developed and developing countries. Taken to the extreme, the two regimes would lead to very different outcomes for the BBNJ. On the one hand, a strict application of the common heritage would result in a permit-based, regulated access to areas beyond national jurisdiction, mandatory, top-down, prescriptive, benefit-sharing obligations, and global enforcement. And of course, proposals to this effect did come about during the discussions in the IGC. In contrast, with a strict application of freedom of the high seas, the status quo would be maintained. First movers' advantage would be entrenched. Flag states would have exclusive jurisdiction on benefit sharing, and there would be no global enforcement. Of course, neither of these options were going to be tenable for an agreement. In fact, we would not have agreement if we were forced to choose between the two. So a balance had to be struck to address the gaps, to level the field of marine scientific research while advancing it and aim for equitable outcomes. Now, it is debatable whether or not the BBNJ agreement actually resolves the question of the applicable regimes, or whether it does so in a balanced way. But in any case, that balance had to be struck across the rules and the governance structure. And I propose that there are three different ways in which we could look at that balance. First of all, there was an acknowledgement of the freedom of marine scientific research while also advancing marine scientific research for the benefit of humanity. And I recall the keynote speaker's observation that the two regimes can sit side by side. A second means of striking a balance was through promoting marine scientific research, development, and application while ensuring comprehensive, fair, and equitable benefit sharing. And then the third angle would be that there was a provision for flexibility at the national level in implementation while balancing governance at the global level. The Part 2 does provide for a notification system and a benefit sharing system. It does set out notification not to limit access, but in fact to enable access or provide greater opportunities for access. The system is as much about promoting marine scientific research and the freedom of marine scientific research as it is about a recognition that ABNJ, areas beyond national jurisdiction, are part of the global commons. But it does remain silent on some fundamental issues, which will have impact on implementation. I will skip over the general provisions because I think the keynote speaker already addressed how the general principles and approaches brought together these competing regimes: common heritage, freedom of the high seas, and fair and equitable benefit sharing. What I want to do in discussing how the balance was struck between acknowledgement of the freedom and benefits for humanity is to look at the scope of the agreement. I think from the outset, the scope was being addressed through many different angles, including in definitions. So use of terms. At one point in time, we had a proliferation of terms being defined with many different definitions. But in the end, I think it was with credit to the Conference of the Parties, 15th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, that led to a breakthrough in how we would eventually address scope. And that COP15 decision addressed the sharing of benefits arising from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources. With that in hand, we saw a move towards a compromise that would allow for, and I'm going to use the short term DSI, to be included but not be defined. And DSI would receive parallel treatment alongside marine genetic resources in Part 2, but the modalities for sharing of monetary benefits from the use of DSI would have to take into account other access and benefit sharing instruments. The trade-offs of this compromise are that DSI is open for interpretation, and in the adoption of the agreement, we've already heard some reflections of what DSI could be interpreted as well. The process for elaboration of monetary benefit sharing modalities could be hamstrung procedurally pending the results of other processes. I won't touch Article 9, although Judge Conrad had a hand on that and helping to reach compromise there. I will move to Article 10, recognizing that I'm probably going to run out of time. So the material scope and the temporal scope are addressed in Article 10. The temporal scope varies depending on when ratification or accession occurs. So there are two scenarios. I guess there could be others, depending on how you interpret this, for determined entry into force, for a respective party. So for those who are parties at the time that the 60th ratification, instrument of ratification is deposited, treaty enters into force 120 days after the deposit. For those who ratify or exceed later, a different starting point applies, and that is 30 days from the deposit of their respective instrument. Any activity that has occurred up until that point may not be covered. So concerns over this and the possibility that this would lead to inequitable outcomes, small island developing states argued for a wider scope on the basis of considerations of global commons. The compromise allows for application of Part 2 to MGRs collected or DSI generated before entry into force, but utilized after. However, as part of that compromise, a party may opt out of this application. I want to observe that the variability of temporal scope per party, as well as the election that a party may take to further curtail material scope, presents challenges to how or whether this section actually deals effectively with treatment of marine genetic resources and DSI as part of the global commons. The question similarly arises in regards to the fish and the military activities exception. In those cases, the exemption applies to the types of activities that could involve marine scientific research in ABNJ on marine genetic resources and digital sequence information, bringing in the whole concept of the flag state jurisdiction. But the agreement provides no guidance on how to safeguard against any potential loopholes. Turning to Article 11, this addresses this neatly addresses in a way how we see freedom of the high seas and common heritage concepts sitting side by side. I will skip forward and look then at the other aspect of striking a balance between promoting marine scientific research and ensuring equitable benefit sharing. So in these articles, we're dealing with notification and benefit sharing, and I think the building blocks for these articles were largely drawn from international practice. But there are some important innovations that are foundational to the benefit sharing regime, which I'd like to highlight. So Article 12 does not regulate access. I went through this already. It's really more focused on promoting marine scientific research. Parties are therefore required to establish certain measures to ensure notification at different points of collection, deposit, utilization, and commercialization with respect to MGRs and DSI. Parties are also required to ensure that there's a disclosure of ABNJ origin where practicable. This provision is relevant in light of the scope of application issues that I just referred to. Embedded in this notification system are three important innovations. One, a centralized mechanism for notifications, a clearinghouse mechanism. The second innovation is the BBNJ standardized batch identifier, which is to be issued by the clearinghouse mechanism. It serves as the link between the notification system and the benefit sharing system itself, and functions also as a means to aggregate information on usage which could support fair and equitable sharing of benefits, for instance, in relation to access, data governance, and monetary benefit sharing. And finally, the data management plan, which is to be prepared according to open and responsible data, which brings in the element, a greater element of transparency here. The main trade-offs in Article 12 relate to flexibility afforded to parties to determine what measures apply, and in the case of disclosure of origin, whether doing so would be practicable. Similar trade-offs can also be seen in Article 14, which deals with fair and equitable benefit sharing. And here, I move now into how we struck a balance between the bottom-up approaches and the global oversight, because this is where we get introduced to the Access and Benefit Sharing Committee. So Article 14 sets out how and for what purpose benefits arising from activities with respect to MGR and DSI are to be shared. It establishes an obligation that non-monetary benefits shall be shared in accordance with the agreement. It requires that parties take measures to ensure that MGR and DSI that are subject to utilization are deposited in publicly accessible repositories and databases. And here we see the BB&J ID identifier acting as a link from notification to benefit sharing. And I would suggest that it also serves the purpose of a credential of compliance. This article also establishes, importantly, that monetary benefits shall be shared through the financial mechanism, and it establishes a process for determining the modalities for sharing of those benefits in the future. Until those modalities are determined, the article provisionally sets out a mandatory assessed contribution that developed parties shall make to the special fund established under the agreement. So the institutional arrangements designated explicitly to support implementation of Part 2 are the clearinghouse mechanism that I introduced already, and the Access and Benefit Sharing Committee. Now, the Access and Benefit Sharing Committee is technical. It also has an advisory and facilitative role in implementation. Its mandate includes providing guidelines for benefit sharing and making recommendations to the COP, including on guidelines and code of conducts for activities covered under Part 2. It's also mandated to provide recommendations on rates or mechanisms for sharing of benefits. Another important aspect of the mandate of the committee is that it also receives reports from parties on implementation, and it prepares reports as well based on those information of the clearinghouse mechanism. Importantly here, again, is the ecosystem of these institutions. So the committee's work is going to be dependent on the functionality of two other institutions in the BB&J architecture. Already mentioned the clearinghouse mechanism and the financial mechanism, which shall receive the funds for monetary benefit sharing. The committee's relationship with other bodies in the agreement will also be relevant to support coherent and robust implementation of this part. These are the Capacity Building and Transfer of Marine Technology Committee and the Implementation and Compliance Committee, as well as the Scientific and Technical Body. Overall, the committee plays an instrumental role in fostering global oversight of implementation from inside through its relationship with these bodies, but also from the outside, because the committee also has an oversight role in relation to parties' implementation and reporting obligations. Pursuant to Article 16, Paragraph 2, parties provide a report to the committee on their implementation of Part 2 provisions. The committee acts as a check and balance for the flexibility otherwise afforded to parties to implement this part of the agreement. So, have we resolved the tensions between common heritage, freedom of the high seas? I think it's important to note that agreeing to a global system through which parties are required to take measures to ensure non-monetary and monetary benefits are shared was a major breakthrough for this agreement. We haven't had that before. Part 2 provides for the accrual of benefits along the whole process of marine scientific research, development, and application, or what has come to be known as the 3 Ps, publication, patent, product. For small island developing states, Part 2 opens up the potential for a new chapter on equity for the ocean. This view is widely held by developing states, many of whom express the conviction that common heritage has been vindicated. However, this view is not shared by all states. Some developed states have stated that they do not consider that the benefit sharing system creates a basis for claiming that marine genetic resources are common heritage. To quote, "These marine genetic resources are not the common heritage of humankind. This agreement does not depart from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which uses the term common heritage of humankind only in reference to the mineral resources of the area." So the tension between the regimes persists. The following is a list of issues that reflect the tensions that will have to be resolved in the implementation phase. And I've referenced all of these already in my presentation. The first, of course, potential loopholes arising from the lack of definition for DFSI and overlap in processes relating to DSI, the variability of scope of application per party, the fishing-related fish exemption, the military activities exemption, and then there's the issue of the fragmentation and implementation with parties being able to interpret what will need to be done at the domestic level, taking into account their respective capacities and national circumstances. Measures across jurisdictions will neither be uniform and may not be equally robust, and there are questions around coherence. And moreover, not all parties will be in a position to enforce the highest standards and measures simply because of capacity constraints. Third, there's a question of reconciling disclosure of origin and the intellectual property rights regime. Issues have already been raised around that during the adoption of the agreement. And then there's a question of how far that authority of the Access and Benefit Sharing Committee will be able to be exercised as an oversight body. But what I would say is that we are at different starting point. We did reach an agreement. We did, in reaching that agreement, move away from a strict interpretation of the high seas regime and towards one that does seem to engender more reciprocity along the lines of what small island developing states put forward as a narrative. Marine scientific research is to be conducted with a view to promoting equitable outcomes for people, irrespective of location, and for the planet. Part 2 finally closes the gap for access and benefit sharing regime for marine genetic resources of areas beyond national jurisdiction. This accomplishment cannot be understated. While the relational approach to the ocean may not resolve the long-standing tension of the two competing regimes for the law of the sea, I would propose that it may nonetheless help to maintain focus on what the agreement is intended to achieve and what many felt had been achieved when the gavel came down, and that is a new chapter for equity on the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janine. I think you gave us a nice overview of almost all provisions of MGR's part.